So we were talking about just basically about buyouts when the last video ended. Buyouts happen because there are significant cost savings to hiring somebody who doesn't have as much experience. And so what we do is we offer somebody to not come back, like $20,000 to not show up. We can either hire a replacement or we can have attrition if there's a position that has too many stated responsibilities for what they actually do. So in other words, the position classification is mismatched. They can get rid of that position by offering somebody to be bought out close to retirement, and then having attrition, making that position shrink, and those other jobs go to somebody else. Generally, people stay in government service for a long time. Like I said, about 25 years. The same happens in local government or state government. Local government employees generally tend to jump from city to city. They don't generally work their way up. But civil service sets up this process by which people generally tend to stay in their careers for a long period of time, as compared to something like the private sector, where they might have 2 or 3 different careers in 5 or 10 different places where they actually worked. Now, how do we pay people in civil service? Well, we talked about position pay relationship. When we compare that amount of money that they earn to a comparable job outside in the private sector, it's slightly higher than a private sector job. By slightly, we're talking about 2%. So a data analyst in the CIA would make about the same as a data analyst somewhere else. Except the exception is like people who have advanced degrees and generally compensated better in the private sector. So there's not a huge bump for advanced education in the government sector compared to the private sector. Now, where we do see significant benefits are in benefits. So dental, health, medical are generally paid for more abundantly in the government, have more protections as compared to the private sector. So so people have, like, I have a good solid health plan, I have dental coverage, I have vision coverage, and my deductibles are very, very low as compared to some other people who are freelancers, who seek private insurance on the private market. Private companies generally tend to pay a little bit less in benefits. So the compensation is about the same, but the benefits are much greater in civil service. Now, the civil service principle is that individuals should receive equal pay for jobs of comparable value. So we talk about position pay relationship, but also routinely states and local governments and the federal government will do a cost analysis or a compensation analysis to see if the positions in their organizations are comparable to the positions outside the private sector, and try and balance the pay accordingly. So that's the civil service. That's the way we tend to staff the bureaucracy now. In most states, there's some sort of protection for against political interference in some of these hiring procedures. Now, the sort of third way we're going to talk about involves unionization. And unionization is a response from the private sector to management abuses. And about 39% of government employees at the federal, state, and local levels are covered by some sort of union. And there's been a rise in public unions largely through the 70s to the 2000s, and a little bit down since the 2000s. Unions work on the principle of collective bargaining. All the employees get together to agree upon a same set of working conditions and pay structures, the conditions of employment. And as they bond together, they negotiate with the management as one unit. That's why it's called collective bargaining. And they all form a union, and to compensate for some of these costs incurred in collective bargaining, the union members pay dues into that system. And police officers' unions exist, school teachers' unions exist. There are all sorts of unions. Now, here's the big problem. In the private sector, when we have a widget factory, the unions get together and they're able to bargain about working conditions. They talk to the management, they say, we need more protective gear, we need to slow down, we need a break, we need to get paid more money, whatever those things are. And if they don't get those things, they can walk off, they can strike. In other words, they can all agree to not show up for work. If you all agree to not show up for work, then that company can't make money. If that company can't make money, it puts pressure on them to negotiate with the union. Especially for highly skilled labor, that's a very, very strong tactic. For non-skilled labor, not a very good tactic for the union. But because they can't replace those employees very quickly. Now, here's the problem with public sector unions. Probably the biggest one is that governments don't generally give the right to their to the unions to authorize a strike. You have to get permission to strike. How does that happen? Well, here's the deal. When you are hired in a civil service position, you are obligated to accountability. You can't just not show up for your job because we're paying you. Well, why is that different than the private sector? Well, in the private sector, you don't have that delegated authority, that delegated responsibility. You haven't given up that oath to be faithful to your organization. So you have to ask permission to strike in a public sector union. Just recently, a couple years ago, a teachers union in Los Angeles asked for permission to strike. And the court system said, no, you don't have the ability to strike because it puts an undue burden on the on the public sector, on parents, that now they have to watch for their kids and it's going to cause all these problems. So they couldn't strike. Well, what do? They demonstrate, they do other things, but the biggest tool that private sector unions have is to strike, to force management to the table. That's one of the biggest problems. Here's the other problem. The civil service system and the budget considerations and elected policymakers make the laws. The laws tell the agencies what to do and how to do that job. There are government laws that cover conditions of work. So a union has to negotiate with not just management, but elected officials. They have to get law changes in some instances to change the conditions of work. So it's not as simple as in the private sector where they can just negotiate with management and management can make all these changes. In the public sector, organizations are established by elected officials. Working conditions are established by elected officials. There are budget constraints, like elected officials pass budgets. The executive branch administers budgets. They allocate resources. They set conditions of employment. So the public sector union has to negotiate with both the elected officials, but also the bureaucracy and the bosses. No executive official can bargain over some of these things. So the union doesn't have one place where they have to bargain. They have to negotiate with everybody else. Now, here's the other problem. All these public sector unions start knowing what's going on in these other agencies. Imagine you have an air traffic controller union and you have a police officers union. If the police officers union gets a concession from government, like they're going to get a 5% raise, you know that the next union over here, the air traffic controllers union, is going to ask for 5% raise. Well, so when we start giving raises to employees, we also have to consider that position classification. In other words, the type of job you do determines the pay, the position-pay relationship. If we raise pay for the GS6s, all the GS6s across the entire government get a raise. So it's not as if, the air traffic controllers can get a raise and not have that spill out across all the federal government. So unions they can't negotiate in the same way in the public sector as they would in the private sector. And the other thing is, there's some things that just can't be negotiated about. So public sector unions try to model private sector unions, but they just exist in different constraints. Now they argue about a lot of other things, and they establish some protections for their workers that are vague in the law. And so they have a role, but you have to sort of think about patronage and civil service and unionization as sort of three different ways in which we establish or we provide protections to employees. So how does that work? Well, patronage values loyalty, partisanship, and they want you to be loyal to their party and that elected leader. The civil service is a system designed to get rid of politics, to work focused on merit, and hiring the right people in the right positions, not based on who they know, but what they know. And then they're obligated to be accountable to that agency. They're to be loyal. Well, unions are essentially, they want you to be loyal to each other, to bond together in brotherhood against management abuses. Well, okay, that's great. Political patronage wants you to be loyal to their party. Civil service system wants you to be loyal to the agency. And unions want to be loyal to your fellow employees. You can't simultaneously be loyal to all of them when they all have conflicting values. So they're all vying for the loyalties of these public employees, and so they all sort of clash in public service. There are some things which we should really consider when it comes to civil service that unions have brought up. For example, how much privacy should civil servants have? We're obligated to accountability, but does that mean your whole life has to be splayed out in front of everybody? If you get a public sector phone, like you're issued a phone from your department, can you make personal calls on the phone? Technically not. Well, what if it's an emergency? Well, okay, does it have oversight? So there's some big questions like, should they have the same amount of privacy a normal citizen has, or should they have, less privacy because they represent the government? If you're a sheriff's deputy, what you watch in your home time or how you drink or, civil disputes get taken place, that comes out in the public sector. It could undermine public confidence in your organization. So you have these higher ethical and moral standards that exist throughout your life as a public servant. Should we give you some privacy? Should we not give you some privacy? So these are like some of the questions. Now, here's an example. President Reagan in 1986 said, if you're a federal employee, you can't use illegal drugs. And if you are unsuitable for employment. Okay, well, we understand illegal drugs are illegal. That's a violation of the law. He says, if you violate the law, we can't trust you to not violate other laws. We should test you. We should test you for drug use. And his big war on drugs was a big push. So a union said immediately, like, no, you can't invade our privacy. What we do at our home, in the private of our home, it shouldn't affect what we do at work. And if I want to use drugs at home, that's my own business. And so they fought urine testing and random testing and what would be required. Now in the military, that makes sense that you can't use drugs because it might impede your performance. But let's say you get high on Friday night after work. By the time Saturday night rolls around, you could totally be ready for work on Monday, maybe, if the drugs are out of your system. But because you broke the law, should we do that? Unions have fought very hard about where that line of privacy exists in the public sector. AIDS testing, for example. If you are a public employee and you have HIV or AIDS or some communicable disease, and you go out and you're representing the government, there's a situation like if you're an emergency responder and you have AIDS, could there be a cross-contamination with you and the person you're resuscitating? Hopefully not, but if you work for the county and maybe you get cut in some emergency situation and you have bloodborne pathogens exposed, you're legally liable. The city's legally liable. The county's legally liable for you as an employee. Should they be able to know that in advance and make assignments for your work so you'd have a reduced risk of contagion? So unions have fought more or less to say, hey, that's private. You shouldn't be able to ask about that. Probably a less weird example is the Hatch Act. In 1936, Congress passed this law that said, look, if we are going to give you protections as civil servants, we can't allow you to engage in the political process. You can't show up at a political campaign in a rally as a federal official, because then you're opening yourself up to your political ideas, and then we can fire you based on your political ideals. And so what's happened is over time that's been amended in a number of ways, but really you couldn't show up at campaign rallies. Now they want you to vote, you're able to engage in rallies, but you can't do it as an official act in your job. So as a political science professor, I cannot, I should not endorse a specific candidate and then go and talk to all of my students about that candidate, about how great they are and how they should all vote for him, because I'm using my public position to advocate for a specific party. That opens me up to all sorts of problems. As a public works director, I shouldn't be able to advocate for a city council member who's of a specific political affiliation. That just it runs against the grain of civil service protections. So there's one other set of restrictions that involve leaving government service, going to the private sector, and then coming back. And we set up these rules to prevent corruption and sort of giving contracts to our friends outside of government in return for favors. So we have some additional restrictions on people leaving government, how fast they can come back in. You can't leave government and work in a private sector for a certain time period. All these vary between federal, state, and local, but in a sense what they're saying is we have given you a position of trust and responsibility as a civil servant, and we want you to hold yourself to a high level of accountability. You can't just use that to go get a job somewhere else in the private sector and then turn around, after you've gotten a raise and paid for some stuff, and then come back and have your same job back or even a more important job. So we have some of these restrictions that are just part of civil service. So what does that mean? We have political patronage, we have civil service, We have public sector unions. All these things are a complex web of how we staff the bureaucracy and how people rise up through the ranks in their career service.